Mrs. Eddy by Hugh Studdert Kennedy. Chapter 18. 3 Years. Lynn, Massachusetts is one of the oldest towns in New England. It was first settled in 1629, less than a year after John Endicott landed at Salem as the first governor of the colony of Massachusetts Bay, and a full year before John Winthrop's company reached Charleston and selected the wind-swept and tide-swept Tri-Montane Peninsula as the site of the future city of Boston. In those days, Lynn was known by the Indian name Saugus, but in or about the year 1637, there came to Saugus a refugee Puritan minister from England, one Samuel Whiting. He was a native of King's Lynn, the old town on the Wash in Norfolk, and not being a separatist with his Farewell Babylon, Farewell Rome, but having a love for dear England deep in his heart, he, with the consent of his fellow colonists, changed the name of the little settlement from Saugus to Lynn. And so it is to this day. Lynn is one of those places which, through all its changing history, has always managed to be important. It has no golden age to look back upon, unless it be the years of the Civil War, when its factories were working night and day to turn out shoes and saddles and harness for the federal forces. Only 10 miles from its big neighbor, Boston, it has maintained its identity through the years and is today one of the great manufacturing cities of New England. 70 years ago, Lynn stood well back from the sea. A few houses had crept out towards the rough, unwalled beach, but where the broad plaza, the sea wall, and promenade are today were only cow paths, winding in and out between the boulders down to the shore. Well out from this shore, but easily reached, save a high tide, was a great mass of rock. It is still there, of course, and known today, as 70 years ago, as the Red Rock. It rises some 20 feet above the water in a series of ledges, and anyone finding his way to the eastern side of it would have nothing between him and the old world but the ocean, with the new world shut off behind him by a wall primeval. As far as nature could provide a symbol, the Red Rock at Lynn was certainly a no-man's land between the old and the new. Today it is visited by many people from all over the world, but 70 years ago it was just another rock on a rocky coast. Through the summer of 1872, on into the fall, and for nearly 3 years off and on, when the weather was fair, a lone woman might have been seen of an afternoon making her way along the cow paths towards the shore, carrying a book and a roll of papers. She would cross the shingle towards the Red Rock and disappear round its southern wall. A couple of hours later, she would reappear again and make her way towards Lynn. This woman was Mary Patterson. Her bitter experience with her first class, the breach with Richard Kennedy, the controversy with Wallace Wright, and other similar experiences had convinced her that her teaching would never be safe from misrepresentation until she had embodied it, not as heretofore in a written manuscript, but in a printed book. Soon after her break from Richard Kennedy, she seems to have become convinced that she should give up teaching, give up everything, and devote herself to this one thing of writing a book. She wrote and worked out a good deal of it as she sat thinking and dreaming on the red rock at Lynn. Quite apart from the mental labor demanded, the writing of this book, Science and Health, as she later called it, must have involved a tremendous physical task. The first edition amounted to some 150,000 words. It had, of course, all to be written in longhand, and after tireless correction, emendation, or complete rewriting, a fair copy of the final recension had to be made. At first, Mary attempted to do all this herself, but later on she had the help of George Barry, a student in the first class. It is only possible to get occasional glimpses of the work as it progresses, but from what few records there are, one may detect in the unfolding story a growing sense of expectation among Mary's small number of loyal followers that something really portentous was in the making. Putney Bancroft, in his memoirs, draws aside the curtain for a moment on the little group struggling along after the defection of Dr. Kennedy, meeting each Sunday in Mary's rooms for a kind of informal service and discussion, and listening to any new interpretation their teacher had to offer. It was a very small band indeed. Samuel Bancroft, George Barry, Dorcas Rawson, Mrs. Miranda Rice, her sister, and a few others. Those of you who call yourselves Christian Scientists, wrote Bancroft half a century later, looking backwards, those who attend the beautiful churches which have been erected can hardly realize the situation in which Mrs. Eddy and her loyal students were placed, or the sentiments with which they were regarded at this time. We were considered much the same as the Holy Rollers or the Howling Dervishes are today. But he adds, we were a happy company, notwithstanding our loss of numbers and the ridicule and contempt with which we were sometimes regarded. These Sunday gatherings in Mrs. Patterson's rooms were very informal in character. Mrs. Eddy read the scriptures to us, Bancroft writes, and gave us an extemporaneous explanation of them. That they had music and singing is clear from a letter of Mary's to Bancroft, written one Friday morning, and reminding him of the meeting to be held on the following Sunday. We have an instrument in the parlor again, she writes. The Barry family will be here, and we shall have music from you all. But perhaps the most important thing that arises out of these informal gatherings, or Bancroft's account of them, is the first clear glimpse they afford of Mary Patterson's teaching, especially in her interpretation of the Lord's Prayer, which Bancroft gives in full. All her life, Mrs. Eddy evidently had a devoted regard for this prayer, and it is no doubt significant of the way in which the principle of her teaching was becoming fixed, that although the actual wording of the interpretation, as given by Bancroft, differs greatly from that finally embodied in Science and Health, the meaning is essentially the same. Bancroft's rendition follows. Teacher, after this manner therefore pray ye. Student, Our Father, which art in heaven. Teacher, harmonious and eternal principle of man. Student, hallowed be thy name. Teacher, nameless and adorable intelligence. Student, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Teacher, control the discords of matter with a harmony of spirit. Student, give us this day our daily bread. Teacher, give us the understanding of God. Student, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Teacher, and truth will destroy sickness, sin, and death as it destroys the belief of intelligent matter. Student, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Teacher, and lead man into soul, and deliver him from personal sense. Student, for thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Teacher, for God is truth, life, and love forever. Mary remained in the apartment over Miss Magoon's school for about 6 months after her break with Kennedy. And then she went to stay for a time with Miss Dorcas Rawson, who was rapidly becoming a very successful practitioner. Mary was better off than she had been for many years, but she needed to conserve her resources. She had no source of income. Her allowance from Dr. Patterson of $200 a year had long ceased, and she had given up her teaching in order to devote all her time to writing. She was, moreover, it is to be imagined, looking ahead to the time that she might need money to publish her book. And meanwhile she had to pay for such help as she needed on it. Dorcas Rawson no doubt urged her to make the change and come to live with her for a time. Mary was glad to do so, but the breakup of her little home in Miss Magoon's schoolhouse ushered in for her 3 more years of wandering from place to place, friend to friend, or from one boarding house to another. Doubtless, Mary Patterson was at this time, as she had often been in the past, and was often to be in the future, a very difficult person to live with. More and more was she utterly absorbed in what she was doing, and more inclined to subordinate everything and everybody to her work. Those who could go along with her, who could share something of her vision and consequently enjoy something of its rewards, far from being irritated over the demands she made upon them, either directly or through her teaching, rejoiced to meet them. But time and again in a student this devotion would wane, displaced or overshadowed often by seemingly the most trivial circumstances. In a long succession of cases, some of which have already been noted, devotion would be transformed overnight to hatred. But it is an interesting fact that in after years, not infrequently after a breach lasting the better part of half a century, these same men and women would bear eloquent testimony to the fact that they still looked back upon the days of their association with Mary Patterson as the Ani Mirabile of their lives. It was possibly for this reason that Mary, after a last bitter experience with the Wentworths at Stoughton, never attempted to stay very long with friends, even when they were as faithful and devoted as was Dorcas Rawson. As she put it very cogently years afterwards, human reason becomes tired and calls for rest. It was a relapse into the common hope. Dorcas Rawson remained faithful through the years to come, but it is doubtful if even she could have borne for long the tremendous pace of Mary Patterson in those days. Once satisfied that the next step demanded of her was to write this book, she literally worked at it day and night. And so, after a few weeks with Dorcas Rawson, Mary took rooms again in the boarding house on Sumner Street, kept by Mr. and Mrs. George Clark, where she had stayed for a time after Dr. Patterson had left some 4 years previously. It was George Clark, Jr., it will be recalled, who years afterwards gave such a vivid description of Mrs. Patterson as he remembered her when she was living with his parents in the summer of 1866. George Clark was now 6 years older, and in his leisure from the inevitable shoe business, had been devoting some time to writing tales of adventure for boys. Mary took an immediate interest in his work, and in his recollections he tells of an incident, interesting for its own sake, but specially so for the light it throws on one of Mary's most lovable characteristics, her ability to rejoice utterly in another's success. It would seem that, at the time she was staying with the Clarks, she began definitely to seek a publisher for the book she was writing. George Clark had finished a book of his own, and probably due to Mary's encouragement, determined to get a publisher for it. And so the two joined forces, and George Clark with his finished copy, and Mary with a prospectus of her book, went up to Boston from Lynn to see a publisher they had decided upon, namely Adams and Company, whose headquarters were on Bromfield Street. George's book, A Boy's Story of Seagoing Life, was accepted at once. Mary's prospectus was rejected with equal promptness. The publishers were confident, they said, that Mr. Clark's book would sell well. But they could see prospects of nothing but loss in a book such as Mrs. Patterson was outlining. With all the enthusiasm engendered by a first acceptance, George was jubilant, and Mary was so full of rejoicing too, and so cheerful in her encouragement and confident expectations for his future that it was not until after they had reached Lynn on the homeward journey that the young author realized how different must be the feelings of his companion. When he did realize it, he recalled 30 years afterwards how contrite he felt over his own apparent selfishness, and how he could almost have found it in his heart to wish that the situation had been reversed. Whether he said anything about it to Mary at the time, he does not relate. But he does say that as they were walking up from the station towards Sumner Street, Mary suddenly caught his arm as they were passing a church and said quietly, I shall have a church of my own some day." She was never long cast down by apparent defeat. Moreover, her life was an almost constant demonstration of a fact insisted upon in her later teaching, namely, that opportunity is always at hand, and that to the individual who recognizes this, the closing of one door is but the signal that another is opening. Frequently, what she found as she passed through the new door was only a very temporary salvation, doomed to further denial. But it made for that eternal renewing of hope, which, especially in these early days, was Mary's sheet anchor. Kennedy had hardly gone his way before Putney Bancroft was at hand. Putney was a very different man. Richard had been brilliant in his way. Putney Bancroft was far from that, but he had a certain quality of patient consideration which was just what Mary most needed. He had lately married, and after Mary had been with the Clarks for some time, he and his wife asked her to come stay with them. They had just purchased a house in Swampscott, and had a good room they could place at her disposal. Mary accepted the invitation gladly, and all went well for a while. She was once again in an atmosphere of understanding, free from the necessity of meeting people whose interests were quite divergent from her own, and she settled down to work with renewed vigor. Bancroft speaks of how earnest she was, and how unremitting in her application. It was not long, however, before the great question of finances began to loom large once more. Mary had paid liberally for the quiet she needed and so much treasured, and funds were running low. The necessity for earning again became urgent. Fortunately, she now had the means always at hand. She could teach, and among her growing band of followers, there were always a number eager to learn more of the teachings set forth in the little Sunday gatherings which Mary Patterson continued to hold in the homes of her friends. She hesitated about adventuring upon another formal class. The difficulties and perversities of her first effort in this direction were still all too fresh in her memory. But she decided to take just a few at a time. Bancroft says 1 or 2, but the fact that she left the Bancrofts about this time in order to secure more accommodation for teaching seems to indicate that she contemplated a larger gathering. She left the Bancrofts with regret, not only because she was fond of them and they had been loyal to her, but because she seems to have felt that the loss of what she could give them for her board and lodging might straiten the young couple unduly. Bancroft, however, makes it clear that she was oversensitive on this score, and in quoting a letter from her on the subject, remarks how it shows her loving kindness and thought for others, particularly her pupils. Certainly, the letter reveals the difficulties under which Mary Patterson was working. She trusts her hosts will not be wounded by her moving elsewhere, but sees no alternative. "I have one student engaged and expect others," she writes, "and it would be awkward trying to teach in so small a place. And there are other handicaps. Every word she would say could be heard in the adjoining parlor, Students would have to come through the parlor to enter. And anyway, Annie's wanting to practice on the piano would make the whole situation untenable. And then, in the same letter, she goes on to speak of her book, the first clear statement that is available. She is within sight of the end. 3 months more will see the first draft completed. But even then, there will still be a great deal to do. It still has to be compiled, and after that, written out for the last time. It was exacting, toilsome work. And Bancroft makes it clear that Mary about this time had moments when she yearned for some sign of human friendship and encouragement. He reproduces a letter from her written on Thanksgiving Day, prefacing it with the remark that, knowing her loneliness so well, he cannot read it or think of it without emotion. To him, it is a cry of distress and suffering as of one lost in the wilderness. Written to Friend Bancroft, the letter is pitiful enough. They tell me this day is set apart for festivities and rejoicing. But I have no evidence of this except the proclamation and gathering together of those who love one another. I am alone today. Family ties are broken, never to be reunited in this world with me. My spirit calls today, but who of all my students hears it? There is little word of it, but from a few poignant sentences like the above, which appear in her letters during the next year or so, it would seem that these months of intense mental and spiritual labor were among the most lonely of her life. Formerly, in times of deep trial, she had a last recourse in her family. She could write to Abigail, and even if Abigail did not understand, she could catch again the strange homesick comfort which flows from ties which had once been happy and joyous, even when they are but pale ghosts of their former selves. But no, even this poor comfort is denied her. Family ties are broken, never to be reunited in this world for me. Only one word appears to have reached Mary in these years from her family, and it comes from a most unexpected quarter, from her stepmother, Mark Baker's widow. It is a loving, complacent note, the very placidity of which may well have thrown into still more bitter relief the lone struggle of Mary's life. Calling Mary her own dear daughter, Mrs. Baker expresses a yearning for more frequent word and sends tenderest loving greetings to yourself and all who are kind to you. But the loneliness of the lonely Thanksgiving Day passed, and in the next picture that Bancroft supplies, Mary and he are busily engaged in working out a new plan full of promise for both of them. Mary had decided that the best answer to the suggestion of failure or stagnation was a definite, expansive forward movement. Richard Kennedy had failed her. Wallace Wright had pilloried her in the public press, and she cries out in one of her letters to Bancroft against the bitterness of it all. Oh, how I have worked, pondered, and constantly imparted my discoveries to this wicked boy that I shall not name. And all for what? God grant me patience. Mrs. Susie Oliver told me once that Richard said he thought I had suffered so much from bad students. If he did not well, it would kill me. But it won't. All the baker in her surged to the surface at such moments. Not only was she not going to succumb to the malice of her enemies, she was going to show herself stronger than ever. And so it was arranged that Putney should go to Cambridge, open an office there, and that Mary would follow as soon as she could find a suitable place to live. Owing to the death of Bancroft's uncle, the firm of Purrington and Bancroft had been dissolved, and Putney had to decide upon a new move in any case. In his account of the matter, he says that the decision was taken only after much deliberation and investigation, and that Cambridge was chosen because it was the seat of learning, that men and women of cultured and developed minds were to be found there, and that some of them would gladly welcome her and the truth she would bring them. Mary seems to have canvassed all the little group before finally deciding on Putney, as is shown in his engaging prim record. Dorcas Rawson had her own little coterie. Mrs. Rice could not desert her husband and child. George Berry was employed in copying her manuscripts and was expected to take an active part in promoting the sale of her book. George Allen had his box factory. Who was available? It was the old story. One had taken a wife, another at the plow, etc., etc. And so the lot fell upon Putney. He set out for Cambridge, carrying with him some newly printed cards and a sign which read, S.P. Bancroft, Scientific Physician, gives no medicine. How seriously he took his mission may be gathered from his diary, in which he records, under date December 7th, 1874, "Today I took another step, and one which I take with fear and trembling, but in which I feel that I am obeying the call of wisdom, which call I dare not disobey. I have today come before the world as a demonstrator of the science of healing the sick by the power of the soul over matter, as taught by Mary M.B. Glover, and which I believe to be the true science of man." Poor Putney! Both he and Mary were doomed to another disappointment. They did everything they could. Mary wrote letters to the Boston and Cambridge press, but the papers inevitably refused to print the letters save as advertisements. Putney sent out letters to prominent divines and men of learning, but received answers to none of them. "Our efforts to obtain recognition were futile," he writes, "and continued to be of no avail." Yet, all the time, healing work was going on, and the fame of it was somehow getting abroad. Mary Patterson, in her letters of encouragement to Putney, refers to several cases, and Putney in his diary speaks of his work and of the advice that Mary gives him from time to time. One item of news in one of Mary's letters is of special significance, as showing how far afield word of her work had traveled. "Miss Sweetland of California," she writes, "has written to me to take her case there."